new must mean new. I think as we saw that a lot of the rhetoric around the student protests, not necessarily generated by the protesters themselves, but a lot of the rhetoric of it was as if a lot of sort of anarchistic ideas were completely new and never been heard of before. And this was supplemented by a kind of technological rhetoric, which sort of those of us who lived through the sort of cyber culture of the 90s would find not new at all. You know, it was at least 20 years old. And it seemed that the problem with this model of new was that it doesn't provide sufficient critique of neoliberalism, to say the least. That in many ways, that its idea of new is still a neoliberal idea, isn't it? And I think the challenge has to be to sort of break down precisely the temporalization or the control of history or control of historical narrative that neoliberalism has managed to impose, such that, I mean, you know, practically as many have said, to be left is to be old, according to this temporality almost. And you know, I think may highlight some of the problems with this kind of anarchistic network model. One of the most foremost of which is kind of institutional memory, really. That, you know, if these things emerge rapidly, quasi-spontaneously, how do they sustain themselves? And secondly, how do they learn? If there's no institutional memory or no mechanism for maintaining institutional memory, how can struggles be learned from, as it were? Because, I mean, part of the things that I think the capital is quite happy for lots of this network rhetoric and horizontal rhetoric to proliferate. No, because whilst the level of ideology, neoliberalism is opposed to the top-down, to the bureaucratic, to the centralised, and to the state. Of course, in effect, it has used all of those things itself. So in this kind of impasse where it's quite happy to use all of that. The impasse for us, rather, it's happy. It's a very happy situation for it, where the dominant ideology is so anti-top-down, anti-statist. Yet, that default situation obviously serves the neoliberal consensus, which has ruthlessly employed all of those means to put forward its project. So I think new must actually mean new, not some kind of, not some sort of rehashed cyber network rhetoric plus lots of kind of standard assumptions of anarchism. And of course, there's a justified fear, I would think, of rhetoric around the new after New Labour, where new there simply meant an acceptance of what I call capitalist realism, the idea that capitalism is the only game in town. All we can do is adapt ourselves to it, and that to be new meant abandoning the idea of overthrowing capitalism. And that is flat with this the overall neoliberal meaning of the term modernisation. Typically when the term modernisation is used in news stories, it's used synonymously with neoliberalisation. When one sees the coverage of the Royal Mail disputes or whatever, it's always that the workers are said to be fighting against modernisation. And where modernisation simply does mean neoliberalisation, especially in this case, privatisation. If you're fighting against modernisation, that's a bad position to be forced into, really. Of course, the reality is they're not fighting against modernisation; they are fighting against privatisation and neoliberalisation. But it's important that we be able to articulate an alternative modernity if the neoliberals have control of the dominant sense of the modern is the neoliberal one, what would be the alternative model of modernity? And this question has a particular sort of purchase and traction at the moment when the right has really lost control of its narrative of history. Never has there been a more spectacular discrediting of a political ideology than we've seen with neoliberalism after the bank crisis and the ongoing kind of crisis of capitalism that we're right in the middle of at the moment. So they've lost control of it. But that doesn't mean that, of course, that as we've seen, that their stories and their narratives, their way of framing what history is, will collapse overnight. Quite clearly, that doesn't happen. But it does mean there's a space for contestation of what an alternative modernity might be. So I'd like to sort of outline sort of 4 elements of what the new left would include. And I think one of them is anti-authoritarianism. We had a discussion of that in the previous time. We don't want to go back to there are reasons from within the left itself that authoritarianism, Stalinism was rejected. It's both oppressive and undesirable, those kind of structures. We simply don't want to go back to them. But that doesn't mean that the struggle against authoritarianism shouldn't necessarily mean libertarianism, of course. But the question is, how do we constitute authority collectively and democratically? And what's crucial here is that the opposition of authority to authoritarianism. I think this is absolutely important that we have a leftist account of what authority is, because what standardly happens is that when any discussion of authority immediately slips into authoritarianism, and of course the right has control over that discourse, and we don't really associate with anything. Anti-authoritarianism will be one element of it. And technology, as Mabel talked about, must be crucial. I mean, we've seen this week in some of the backlash to the Occupy London is look at these protesters. They're anti-capitalist, but they've got iPhones. So why does that ludicrous kind of critique seem to make sense? It seems to make sense because of some of the kind of political aesthetics I think surrounds something like that. That Occupy London, whereby it's local, it's organic, it's all kind of but I mean I think we should hold on to the sides of Marxism which stress kind of the good sides of things like mass production, etc. And technology. No, Marxism is technology positive, and it's not capital that makes iPhones, it's workers, isn't it? And quite clearly, there's no intrinsic relation between something like an iPhone and capitalism. Fairly safe ground with those two. But the other thing is more controversial, but I don't think they ought to be. Bureaucracy. Okay, now part of that, one of the paradoxes that I point out in my book is the way in which there's relentless anti-bureaucratic rhetoric of neoliberalism. Okay, but there's a rhetoric of that, but reality is a massively increased bureaucracy. It's familiar to practically anyone working today. That the nature of bureaucracy has changed. It's no longer imposed on us. It's no longer just imposed; it's also imposed on us from outside. That we're increasingly required to do our own self-surveillance as part of work. Particularly if you're working in public services. Absurd levels of if you're a teacher, like kind of being log books. Absurd kind of inventory of self-surveillance, which is now accepted as part of work. Okay, so this form of bureaucracy is really bad. But if we're in a modern technologised society, if we want things like at the NHS, and I think the NHS is a problem example for many of the sort of libertarians or anarchistic currents that are out there at the moment. If you want something like the NHS, you need bureaucracy. The question is, what kind of bureaucracy do you have? And also alongside that, management. I think we need to be positive about management. If we want a sort of more rational planned society, we need management. But management, just as bureaucracy, doesn't have to be either kind of old-style, centralised, Stalinist bureaucracy, demonised by neoliberalism, nor does it have to be the absurd kind of market Stalinism of that we found under neoliberalism. In the same way, management doesn't have to be managerial. Management should be there to make workers' lives easier. To coordinate things. Not the opposite, but I'm sure that what our experience is where basically we find that our jobs are somehow there to justify the jobs of managers rather than the other way around. So the question is, I think we have to think about again, what kind of management do we want? Given that if we're not business, we don't believe that necessarily people can spontaneously self-organise into the most rational and effective units. Then it's a question of thinking about management in a left-wing way. Okay, so I'll leave it there. See, today there's sufficient agreement here that we can move forward. What we think a new left can look like, and agreeing with practically everybody really that the reason why things are moribund in Parliament is not down to Parliament itself. It's down to the space outside Parliament, and the fact that the forces of society aren't there putting pressure on Parliament, putting pressure on decision makers. So even if you're reformist, you'd have to accept that it's the space outside Parliament where things need to be happening now. And it is that space of it's a space between the private realm and the state, isn't it? That's the space that we need to occupy. And that's what one of the good things about trade unions is that they could occupy that space. Because it's making the link between people's everyday life as a worker and the broader political sort of programme. And so that's the space that we need to be occupying in order to kind of shift things forward.